They were waiting for her to fail. That part was obvious, had been obvious from the moment Noreen Quartey walked into the boardroom on the 14th floor of Meridian Financial Group's Toronto office, a Tuesday in February, the kind of cold that made the windows sweat from the inside. She had a leather portfolio under one arm and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched yet. The coffee was from the cart downstairs, not the good machine on the executive floor. She hadn't been given access to that one yet. She would never be given access to that one. That was the plan, anyway. Lawrence Pitfield had been division director of Meridian's Western Canada Risk Assessment Team for 11 years. In those 11 years, he had hired 43 analysts. 39 of them were white, 2 were South Asian, 1 was Korean-Canadian, and Noreen Quartey, 52 years old, 26 years in actuarial finance, former senior partner at a Vancouver firm that Meridian had quietly absorbed in a merger, was the first black woman to sit at his table. He had not chosen her. She had come with the acquisition as part of the deal. Technically, she was a principal analyst, a title that sounded important and meant, in practical terms, that she was expensive to fire and easy to ignore. Pitfield had learned this the hard way with the Vancouver merger. The lawyers had been very clear. Quartey's contract transferred. Her seniority transferred. Her compensation transferred. What didn't transfer, apparently, was Pitfield's respect. He made this known in small ways. The way he'd pause just a half-second too long before saying her name in meetings, like he had to remind himself she was there. The way her reports, thorough, meticulous, the kind of work that other analysts photographed with their phones for reference, were described in team emails as contributions from the Western file, not from Noreen, not from Quartey. From the Western file, like she was a cabinet, not a person. The way he'd assigned her just 3 weeks after she arrived, the Harrington account. Let's talk about the Harrington account for a moment, because this is where it gets interesting. The Harrington account was a 340 million yen commercial real estate portfolio, strip malls, mixed-use developments, a few mid-density residential builds, spread across 4 provinces, 3 of which had undergone significant municipal zoning changes in the past 18 months. The portfolio had been sitting in Meridian's deferred assessment queue for 7 months. 2 previous analysts had started on it and quietly handed it back. One of them, a 29-year-old named Fletcher Abrams, had referred to it in a Slack message, later screenshotted and widely circulated, as the swamp. Pitfield gave it to Noreen on her 3rd week. He framed it as an opportunity. "We think your background in Western markets makes you uniquely positioned," he said, in a meeting she had not been told was a meeting until she arrived and found 6 people sitting around a table looking at her. The Vancouver team had strong exposure to exactly this type of file. Noreen looked at the briefing package he slid across the table. She didn't open it. She looked at him. "What's the delivery timeline?" she asked. "End of quarter," he said. "So, 6 weeks." She picked up the package. "I'll need full data access to the municipal rezoning records for all 4 provinces." There was a pause. Someone cleared their throat. "We can get you partial access through the public databases," said the compliance coordinator, a young man named Elliot who had the look of someone who had been told, before this meeting, exactly what to say. "Public databases are 18 months behind," Noreen said. "This file is time-sensitive. I'll need the licensed feeds." Another pause. Longer. "We'll look into it," Pitfield said, in a tone that meant he would not look into it. She took the package home. She read it on her kitchen table that night, with the radio on low. One of those late-night CBC jazz programs, the kind her husband used to keep on while he read. And by the time she was on page 47, she understood exactly what the Harrington account was. It wasn't a swamp, it was a puzzle. A complicated, layered, genuinely difficult puzzle that required someone who could hold 7 variables in their head simultaneously and track their interactions over time. Noreen had been doing that kind of work for 26 years. She made herself a cup of tea. She got a notepad. She started at the beginning. The licensed data feeds never came. She requested them twice more in writing, once through Elliot, once directly to IT, with Pitfield copied, and both times received responses that were technically responsive and practically useless. "Request is under review," Procurement timelines apply. We'll circle back. She documented every one of these responses. This was a habit she had developed early in her career, in a different city, a different firm, a different name on the door, but the same particular chill in certain rooms when she walked in. She'd learned to document. She built her own dataset instead. This sounds simpler than it was. She pulled the public records, yes, 18 months behind, but useful as a baseline. She cross-referenced them against Meridian's existing internal files, which she did have access to. She called 3 contacts at provincial assessment offices, colleagues she'd worked with over the decades, people who trusted her and could speak to patterns without breaching anything formal. She used those conversations to calibrate her models, not as source data, but as a check. She was meticulous about the line. It took her 5 weeks and 4 days. What she produced was not the report Pitfield had been expecting. He had been expecting, she would later understand, a partial analysis, something incomplete, something she'd have to apologize for, that he could use to justify keeping her in the deferred category, perhaps reassigning her, perhaps suggesting, gently, always gently, that the Toronto market was quite different from Vancouver, and that perhaps her expertise was more suited to certain file types. What she delivered instead was a 94-page risk assessment with 4 executive appendices, a flagged portfolio exposure of approximately $22 million in misclassified assets, a remediation pathway with 3 options at different cost-to-benefit ratios, and a 1-page summary that any board member could read in 4 minutes and understand completely. She sent it to Pitfield on a Thursday afternoon. She sent it him directly, as per protocol. He did not respond. She found out what he did with it by accident. The following Monday, she arrived at the office to find a meeting on her calendar that hadn't been there Friday. Harrington Portfolio Review, 10 a.m., Boardroom C. She assumed she'd been added as a note-taker. She brought a notepad. She was not a note-taker. She arrived to find 9 people in the room, including 3 members of Meridian's senior leadership team, the chief risk officer, and a managing director she recognized from the company's annual report. On the screen at the front of the room was a presentation, 17 slides, her analysis, her numbers, her remediation pathway, all 3 options, her language, her structure, her appendices condensed and reformatted into slides. Pitfield's name was on the title slide, not hers. She sat down. She put her notepad on the table. She listened to Lawrence Pitfield present her work to the executive leadership of Meridian Financial Group, watched him field questions, watched him handle the follow-ups, some of which he handled well, because he wasn't unintelligent. He'd had the weekend to study her report, and some of which he stumbled on because there are things you can study and things you can only know if you built them yourself. She said nothing. Not then. There is a particular kind of anger that doesn't look like anger at all. It looks like stillness. It looks like a woman sitting at a boardroom table, one hand folded over the other, watching a man present her work to people who will never know the work was hers. It looks like patience. It looks like professionalism. People who don't know will look at her and see composure. People who know will see something being memorized. Every slide, every claim, every number she'd built from scratch on her kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with the jazz radio on. She was memorizing the record. After the meeting, she requested a one-on-one with Pitfield. He agreed. Of course he agreed. In a busy office, in front of witnesses, what else do you do? They met in his office the next afternoon. He offered her a seat. He sat behind his desk. He had his own coffee, from the executive machine, naturally, and a yellow legal pad that he kept touching the corner of, like a nervous habit. I wanted to follow up on the Harrington file, she said. Great presentation this morning, he said. The leadership team was very impressed. I noticed my name wasn't on the slides. He blinked. The deck was prepared by our communications team from the briefing materials. I'll make sure your contribution is noted in the follow-up documentation. My contribution, she said. Absolutely, the analysis was a real team effort. She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze for about 4 seconds and then looked at his legal pad. I'd like that in writing, she said. The acknowledgement of my authorship of the analysis. He smiled the smile of a man who has done this before, has managed this particular kind of conversation, has learned that if you stay pleasant and non-committal, most people will eventually accept the non-answer and leave. "Of course," he said. "I'll have Elliot draft something." She nodded. She stood. She buttoned her jacket. "I'll expect it by end of week," she said, and she left. Elliot never sent anything. She had a lawyer by the following Tuesday. Not a dramatic thing. She'd had a relationship with an employment lawyer for years, a firm in Waterloo she'd first used in a different situation, at a different company, a long time ago. Her name was Judith Okafor Bell, and when Noreen called her, she didn't have to explain much. "Tell me what you have documented," Judith said. "Everything," said Noreen. There was a brief pause. "Good," said Judith. What happened next took time. This is the part of the story where people want a dramatic confrontation, a moment in a hallway, a raised voice, a scene. Real accountability doesn't usually work that way. It is, in Noreen's own words, and yes, she did eventually tell this story, in a forum you might not expect, administrative and tedious and absolutely worth every single tedious hour. The formal complaint went to Meridian's HR department first. Standard process. Noreen had low expectations for that stage, and her expectations were met. The complaint then went to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, because it needed to go somewhere with actual authority, and because Judith had seen enough of these situations to know that internal HR processes were designed, structurally, to protect the institution. Alongside the tribunal process, Judith sent a letter, formal, measured, detailed, to 3 members of Meridian's board of directors. Not all of them. 3 specific ones, chosen carefully, who Judith knew by reputation to take governance matters seriously. Noreen's documentation, the emails, the meeting notes, the time-stamped drafts of the Harrington analysis, the access request logs, the Slack records, the calendar invites, the presentation file metadata that showed, unambiguously, when the slides were created and from what source documents was attached in full. It was, as one of those board members would later describe it privately, a remarkably thorough package. Pitfield was placed on administrative leave 6 weeks after that letter was sent. He was not fired immediately. These things are rarely immediate. There was an internal review. There were conversations with his own legal counsel. There were, Noreen later heard through channels she would not name, several difficult meetings in which certain patterns of behavior, the Harrington presentation was not. It turned out, the first time he had repurposed a subordinate's work came into clearer view. He resigned in April. The announcement in the company's internal newsletter described it as a mutual decision reached following a period of reflection. The newsletter thanked him for his 11 years of service. Noreen read it in the kitchen of her Mississauga home, standing at the counter, the same notepad she'd used for the Harrington analysis sitting on the table behind her. She put the newsletter down. She picked up her coffee. She thought about the jazz radio her husband used to keep on, and how quiet the kitchen had been since he died 3 years ago, and how she'd learned to find the stillness useful instead of empty. She had a deposition to review. She had a second file, a smaller one, an insurance portfolio from Calgary, that needed her attention by Thursday. She sat down at the table and opened her laptop. A month later, a junior analyst named Priscilla Farrow stopped her in the hallway outside the 4th floor printers. Priscilla was 27, had been at Meridian for 2 years, and had the look of someone who had been wanting to say something for a long time and had finally decided today was the day. "I just wanted you to know," Priscilla said, speaking quickly, as if she'd rehearsed this and was afraid to lose momentum, "that some of us knew. About Harrington, about what he did. We just didn't." She stopped. "I'm sorry we didn't say anything sooner." Noreen looked at her, not unkindly. "Why didn't you?" she asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was an actual question. Priscilla looked at the floor. "We thought it wasn't our place. Or we thought, I don't know, that it would sort itself out." "It sorted itself out," Noreen said, "but not because it does that on its own." She let that sit for a second. "What are you working on?" she asked, and Priscilla blinked, surprised by the pivot. "Currently, what file?" "The Dundas Avenue mixed use," Priscilla said. It's complicated, actually. The heritage designation overlaps with "Come find me at 2," Noreen said. "I know that file type." She walked back to her desk. Later that year, at a risk assessment conference in Ottawa, one of those industry events where the wine is mediocre and the name badges never quite stay pinned, a moderator asked her, during a panel discussion on professional ethics in financial services, whether she had any advice for young professionals who encountered systemic bias in their workplaces. She thought about it for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to say it correctly. Document everything, she said. Not because you're building a case, though you may end up doing that, but because documentation is the habit of a person who knows the value of their own work. It tells you that your work is real, regardless of what anyone else decides to do with it or say about it. Write down what you did. Write down when you did it. Keep the drafts. Keep the emails. Do this from the beginning. Someone in the audience raised their hand. And if the system doesn't respond? It often doesn't, not right away, she said. That's why you need to know where the system ends and the next level of accountability begins. Your HR department is not the end of the road. It is, frequently, not even a speed bump. A few people laughed, a little more openly than they probably expected to. But here is the other thing, she said, and the room got quiet in a particular way that rooms get when someone is about to say something that isn't on the prepared remark sheet. Know your work. Know it so completely, in such detail, that no one can take it from you in any way that actually matters. Pitfield. And she paused because this was the first time she'd said his name in a public setting, and she'd made a deliberate choice to say it. Stood in front of the most senior people in that company and presented my analysis, and he knew enough to get through most of it. But there were 3 questions he couldn't answer, 3 moments where the seams showed. Because you cannot present work you didn't build the same way you can present work you built yourself. The depth isn't there. She looked out at the audience. Know your work at the level of depth. That's where it lives. That's where no one can follow you. She is still at Meridian. Pitfield is not. The Harrington account was resolved using her remediation pathway. Option 2, as she'd recommended, moderate cost, 3-year horizon. The $22 million in misclassified assets was restructured without significant loss. The chief risk officer sent her a note after the final settlement, a handwritten one on Meridian letterhead, which she kept in the same folder as her documented access requests and the time-stamped draft files. She keeps that folder in a drawer in her home office, the one that looks out onto the backyard. The jazz radio plays in the kitchen most evenings. Not every night. Some nights the quiet is enough. But most evenings, when she's working late, she keeps it on, not because it fills the silence, because it always made the thinking clearer.